Hello and welcome to my second video on the Qiao vessels. This is a series of videos that I'm doing on the Qiao vessels and specifically some of the more difficult concepts that arise in my book, Archaeology of the Qiao Vessels. So I'm doing these lectures hopefully to try to flesh out some of those ideas and give further context to people who might be interested, either having read the book or having not read the book, either way. And so today we're going to be talking about the Inner Canon, which is sort of the focus of a lot of my research in the book, and specifically how the Inner Canon views the Qiao vessels as collaterals, and what that means for the theory and the practical application of our understanding of the Qiao vessels. So first I'll outline just what we'll be talking about in the lecture today. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about just reviewing what we touched upon last time, because the content of this lecture is actually directly related to the last lecture. And then we're going to get right into the connection of the Yin Qiao to the abdomen and Wei Qi circulation. And then we're going to talk about collateral theory and how this relates to this Yin Qiao connection to the abdomen, and also how to apply these ideas in clinic, how the Inner Canon would suggest to apply them. And specifically, part of that application has to deal with cross needling, which is 谬刺 in Chinese, and is one of the primary forms of treatment for the Qiao vessels. And then we'll talk about the other needling techniques applied for the Qiao vessels in the canon. And then I'll finish with a bit of a discussion of the connection or lack thereof between the Yang Qiao and the Yin Qiao. Though the focus here will be mostly on the Yin Qiao. So the last lecture was somewhat related to this lecture. But I started out by just talking about some of the issues that come with researching the Qiao vessels, and I highlighted some of the inconsistencies between different texts, which is one of the big problems with researching the Qiao vessels. And then in the second half of the lecture, I got into the specific vision of the Qiao vessels as they appear in the Classic of Difficulties and the Inner Canon. And so that vision involves what I call like the problem of Wei Qi in the Classic of Difficulties and the Inner Canon. In the Classic of in the Inner Canon, we have the construction of the channels, the closed circulatory channel system. Prior to that, there hadn't been a closed system, and so a lot of, for instance, Spiritual Pivot 10, Spiritual Pivot 11, a lot of chapters are devoted to explaining sort of just the theory of this circulatory system, how it works, and so forth. And out of that explanation, out of this grappling with theory, comes sort of a new question, which is, if you have a closed circulatory system, what about all of the fluids that are outside of the circulatory system? How do they circulate in and out of the channels? How do they get in and get out? And what happens if there's some sort of dysfunction during that process? And so I sort of identified two quotes, one that I think are pretty representative of this line of thinking, both in the Inner Canon and the Classic of Difficulties. In the Inner Canon, it comes from Spiritual Pivot 17, and the quote is, "The channel qi that never stops moving is like flowing water, like the movement of the sun and moon in its interminable motion. The qi that overflows from the channels irrigates the organs within and moistens the interstices outside." Now this is coming right in the context of a discussion of the Qiao vessels in this Spiritual Pivot 17, the length of the vessels. And you can see how it's directly highlighting this question of this sort of difference between the qi circulating in the channels and the qi circulating outside. And in this particular passage, the Yellow Emperor is sort of saying, why, what is this, how does this qi get into and out of the channels? It's exactly the kind of question that I was just saying that we might be grappling with, or that the Inner Canon authors were grappling with at the time of writing. And just very interestingly, it also is just directly connected to a discussion with the Qiao vessels, even though it doesn't specifically mention how this discussion relates to the Qiao vessels. It's sort of an interest. So you have to do some sort of mental mathematics to get to how they actually connect. Now, in the Classic of Difficulties, we have sort of a similar quote. It says, "The ancient master created a system of irrigation canals and dredged them often in case of flood. When the rains poured down from the heavens and the canals overflowed, the waters flowed chaotically, and you, the Great, could no longer control them." So this comes in the discussion of the 8 extras. And basically it's saying that when the rain pours down from the heavens and overflows, this is basically talking about when the channels become replete and some blood, qi or blood from within the channels spills out, then all of a sudden it can't be controlled by those channels. It's no longer within the purview of the circulatory system, and actually it goes into the 8 extra system. So again, it's linking the 8 extras to this idea of this tension or this grappling with where qi goes once it leaves the circulatory system, and what happens, how do we get back and forth between the extra channel and intra-channel system. In the Classic of Difficulties, the idea is just that it can't get back into the channel system once it goes into the 8 extra system, and actually it then produces disease. So that's the view that comes in the Classic of Difficulties. In the Inner Canon, by contrast, the 8 extras are very much linked to the circulatory system. And not only that, but the Qiao vessels themselves play quite a role in that linkage. And I didn't get into how that actually works, but that will be some of the focus of this video. So then I started talking about also how in the Inner Canon, it really highlights how the Qiao vessels are implicated in these pathologies that deal with this sort of wayward Wei Qi, this wayward extra vessel Qi that just stagnates somewhere and can't circulate. And so that comes up in yawning, and although it's not mentioned explicitly, but Zhang Jingyue connects it to the Qiao vessels. And then very prominently in insomnia and somnolence, it is explicitly connected to the Qiao vessels and to this dysfunction of Wei Qi. And it also notably goes into some very explicit discussions of how Wei Qi just gets stuck somewhere and can no longer circulate properly. And that's what's causing these illnesses. And these illnesses also manifest with changes in the Qiao vessel itself. And by treating the Qiao vessels, we can then treat these illnesses. So the question is, what is, last time we mentioned that there were these connections, but we didn't really get into how it all actually works. How does the Inner Canon actually see, the treating the Qiao vessels, helping to relieve these pathologies. And so that's what I want to get into today. I want to get into sort of the specifics of the mechanism, as well as the specifics of treatment. How were different diseases should they thought to be treated in the Inner Canon? Because there are a few different ways. So typically when we think of the Yin Qiao vessel, I think probably a lot of people know that it starts from the bottom of the foot, and then it travels up the inner malleolus, and it eventually passes up through the in phase, up through the throat and into the eye. That's at least the pathway that's given in the spiritual pivot. But then if we look in the simple questions, we see that most, if not all, of what it treats is in the abdomen. And so there's a bit of a sort of a conflict there, sort of a tension. But what I'd like to argue is that basically you can more or less ignore this pathway that exists in the spiritual pivot of the Yin Qiao going up to the eye, that really it should just be going into the abdomen, and that it's sort of a collateral of the foot lesser in channel that networks with the interstices of the lower abdomen. All right, so that's a fairly sort of controversial claim. So how do I get there? Well, I'd like to talk about some of the descriptions that exist in both the spiritual pivot and in the simple questions that really just point to this pretty obviously. So we just talked about this quote of this, there's qi traveling in the circulatory system, and then there's also this qi that's just outside of the circulatory system, and it irrigates the organs, and it moistens the interstices. Now, interestingly enough, Zhang Jingyue, the Ming Dynasty commentator, said this is talking about the Qiao vessel and how it goes only to the 5 organs. Okay, it doesn't. We'll see that that's not necessarily the case, but that it only has to go to the 5 organs. But this is what he indeed takes from this line, and the length of the vessels is mostly talking about the Qiao vessels. But how did Zhang Jingyue make this conclusion? Well, this line from length of the vessels in LS 17, it's actually sort of a kind of commentary on this line from LS 76, the circulation of Wei Qi, which says when Wei Qi enters into the in phase, it passes from the lesser yin channel and irrigates the kidneys irrigate the heart, so on and so forth. And then eventually from the organs, it then passes back up through the eye and then goes in again to the yang channels. And so this line doesn't explicitly mention the Qiao vessels, but clearly this question of it, because it says Wei Qi only travels through the 5 organs, but not in the 6 bowels. It's clearly, that line is in LS 17 is clearly talking about this line in LS 76. But is there any connection between this LS 76 line and the Qiao vessels? Well, it turns out there really is. You see here, and this is the Ban Xia Tang passage. It says Wei Qi circulates through yang during the day and then in at night, and always passes through the lesser yin conduit to course through the 5 organs and 6 bowels. Notably, this time it talks about the 6 bowels. And then it says if there's some kind of problem in this process, with the Wei Qi circulation, what happens? The Yang Qiao vessel becomes deranged. There's going to be a problem with the Yang Qiao vessel. There could easily also be a problem with the Yin Qiao vessel. So it's connecting this movement of Wei Qi from the Yang phase into the Yin phase via the lesser Yin so-called conduit that comes from Unshold, and it connects it to the Qiao vessels. So that's one place where we see it. Now we also see another place. Again, here in Lodging of Evil in LS 76, it says, Wei Qi enters the soul of the foot, exits via the inner malleolus, courses through the Yin phase, and rejoins with the eye. So this is again the path of Wei Qi. Now look at the path of the Yin Qiao vessel. It also starts at the sole of the foot. It ascends the inner malleolus. It travels straight up, goes into the Yin phase, and again it rejoins with the eye. So no other channel really does this besides the Yin Qiao vessel. You can't. The kidney channel doesn't rejoin to the eye. You might say, well, the bladder channel, it goes to the eye. Well, it also doesn't enter the sole of the foot or go to the inner malleolus. So this pathway of the Yin Qiao vessel quite overlaps with the spiritual pivot's idea of how Wei Qi travels in the body. So for me, I mean, this is quite compelling. I mean, first you have Zhang Jingyue talking about, how he thinks this passage, which is discussing how Wei Qi flows from the Yang phase into the Yin phase, is talking about how that process is mediated by the Qiao vessel. And then you see how, again, if there's a pathology involving this Wei Qi moving from the Yang phase into the Yin phase, it shows up as a problem with the Yang Qiao vessel or the Yin Qiao vessel. So again, that seems quite compelling. And then even the pathway of Wei Qi as it enters into the Yin phase, as discussed in the spiritual pivot, is just exactly the same as the pathway of the Yin Qiao vessel. So all told, though it doesn't really mention it explicitly, it seems pretty clear that somehow this Yin Qiao is responsible for spiriting this, being the conduit of Wei Qi as it passes from the Yang phase, sort of the outside of the body, into the Yin phase. And so the question is, how does it do that? The topic of this lecture is about collaterals. And so in my opinion, it's acting as a kind of collateral of the lesser Yin, the foot lesser Yin kidney channel. Now, we kind of know, in school we learn about collaterals. We mostly learn about the 15 collaterals, the collaterals of all the major channels, and then usually the Ren and Du are also included, and also the greater collateral of the spleen. And so our understanding of a collateral is that it links the one channel to another channel, right? And that's how we would use them clinically, typically. But the collaterals, as they exist in the spiritual pivot and in the simple questions, are not limited to just these collaterals. Actually, Huang Longxiang, who I mentioned in the previous talk, is a historian of Chinese medicine in China, a very well respected one at that, says, there are all kinds of collaterals mentioned in the Inner Canon, you can't really be just limited to these 12 or these 15. And he says, why actually was it just these 15 collaterals that are mentioned in LS10? And he says, well, the reason is actually because, again, I talked about this a little bit in the last talk, it's about numbers and the importance and the significance of certain numbers. So he says 15 collaterals, and then you add to that 12 channels. Okay, these are the primary components of the circulatory system. Now, 15 plus 12 is 27. He says 27 turns out to be a very important number in sort of the Chinese philosophy. And the reason for that is because it's 27 is equal to 3 nines. Now, the 3 nines are the nines of heaven, the 9 of heaven, the 9 of man or humanity, and the 9 of the earth. Now, what is 9? 9 is the cardinal directions. Okay, well, there's usually 4 cardinal directions, but then you add on to that northwest, northeast, and then southwest, southeast. So that's 4 more, and then you have middle, which is in itself a kind of direction. You have 9. And so the sky was broken up in this way before, and the earth was also broken up in this way. And then, of course, because man or humanity has to mirror the heavens or mirror nature, it also has 9. One explanation is there are 9 orifices. So this contains sort of 2 concepts. One is this mirroring of humanity with nature, which is very important, sort of early concept. And then the other is the cardinal directions as they relate to the heavens. Now, in 1 year, the handle of the Big Dipper will point in all 4 cardinal directions. And so there's a sense in which the cardinal directions as they exist in relation to astronomy and to the sky are sort of circulatory in nature, and they harken back to a circulatory idea. And so, of course, just like 28, which is the 28 houses of the ecliptic, as they're envisioned in East Asian, or more specifically in Chinese thought, relate to the circulation of the moon throughout 1 month. Again, this number 27, it harkens back to a very circulatory idea. And then even better, it also harkens back to or is sort of redolent of this humanity, earth, and the heavens all communicating with each other and mirroring one another in their form and number. So just as a kind of geeky aside, I just wanted to show a picture here of the location of, or more the orientation of the Big Dipper in the various seasons. And you'll see here in spring, if this is the North Star, it's pointing east. Then in summer, it's pointing south, sort of. And then fall, again, it's pointing west. And then in winter, it points north. So it's first of all, it's always circulating around the North Star, so it has that circulatory idea already embedded in it. And then just the fact, and then what connects it to, or connects the cardinal direction idea with circulation is also the fact that it's pointing in different directions throughout the year. And so it's connected to seasonality, to the movement of the heavenly bodies and so forth. And then one other kind of interesting aside, this is more just like in the realm of conspiracy theory, but some people actually do think that the swastika symbol comes also from this movement of the Big Dipper throughout the year. Obviously, that's not really, I don't know if it hasn't been proven or anything, but is sort of interesting food for thought. The swastika is a very, very old symbol. I think some people say 5,000 years old. Obviously ancient peoples would have been very, and it also appears in many different cultures. So ancient peoples would have been very preoccupied with the skies. So it's maybe possible. Anyways, so the collaterals. This is why Huang Longxiang, he concludes that the collaterals they're not limited to 15. 15 is just it's not an arbitrary number, but it's a number that satisfies certain philosophical and numerical aesthetics. And actually, there are quite a few other important collaterals. For instance, Xu Li, the collateral of the stomach, is not included. In one version, Du and Ren are not included. That's the classic of difficulties, and they're not included to the inclusion of the Qiaos. And then vice versa, actually, in the Inner Canon. But then there are also lots of other kinds of collaterals. So, for instance, we're all pretty familiar with the lower transport point of the triple burner. But I don't know if everyone knows that that's actually considered a collateral as well. It's considered a collateral of the greater Yang channel. And basically all that means, at least according to Huang Longxiang, is it's, first of all, collaterals are visible on the surface of the body. So at the back of the knee, there's a visible vein there. Or in some cases, there's also spider veins that become visible there. And those can be then correlated with certain diseases that appear when that vein, especially the spider vein, appears. And that's how some collaterals just come to be. And so in this case, that would be the genesis of Wei Yang. And so that's another kind of collateral, but it doesn't connect to channels to each other. It's more just a isolated correlation of a diagnostic observation and a disease. But later on, such observations can then be incorporated or co-opted into a circulatory system. Now there's even another kind of collateral, which is the great collateral. There's the great collaterals of the stomach is mentioned. There's the great collateral of the spleen. And so again, not to be overly reliant on Huang Longxiang, but his point is he believes that these are collaterals that connect to an organ specifically. And where they go from there is not necessarily important, but they should connect to an organ. And so you have the spleen great collateral, you have the stomach great collateral, and then as it turns out, you also have a lesser in great collateral as well, which is mentioned in a few places in the spiritual pivot. Now, I don't believe that you need this argument in order to say that the Yin Qiao vessel is a collateral of the lesser yin vessel that networks to the abdomen. But this, I think, even strengthens the argument a little bit more. This argument that I'm going to make now. If this turns out to be true, it's also a very interesting and compelling idea of how the 8 extras are connected to each other, because we don't have that much of an idea of how, for instance, the Chong and the Qiao vessels are connected. But I think this makes a lot of sense, because it says the upper pathway of the Chong vessel, it emerges in the nasopharynx and seeps into the Yang channel collaterals and irrigates the eye. The lower pathway of the Chong vessel irrigates the greater collateral of the foot lesser in and emerges from Qi thoroughfare. Now, the first thing to notice here right away is that the first part of this quote is describing exactly the movement of Wei Qi into the eye, basically before it enters into the Yang Qiao vessel. This I go into the book. I don't really describe it here. We're going to be focusing mainly on this lower pathway. So is the lower pathway then going to the greater collateral of the foot lesser in? Is this talking about the Yin Qiao vessel? Let's see. So it talks about this Qi thoroughfare, and it says the Chong vessel is the sea of the channels. It governs the seeping and irrigating of the interstices. It connects with Yang brilliance at the ancestral sinew and meets again with Yang brilliance at the Qi thoroughfare. So here again, the thing to note is that the Chong vessel is also deeply tied to Yang brilliance. And it's tied to it, one at the ancestral sinew and two at Qi thoroughfare, the pulsing point in the inguinal region, which is the femoral artery. Now, it's also another thing to note here is how it talks about the Chong vessel. It seeps and irrigates the interstices. So this seeping and irrigating of the interstices is very much an extra channel activity. So it's almost like it's taking this sort of food and grain essence from Yang brilliance, and it's seeping and irrigating the interstices. It's circulating Wei Qi is essentially another way to say it. And one big expression of that is that Qi thoroughfare. Now, interestingly, Wang Hongtu, a very sort of important scholar of the Inner Canon, says Yangming is the grand entrance through which Wei Qi passes from the Yang phase through the Qiao vessel and into the Yin phase. And so where does he get that? Well, he says it's from circulation of Wei Qi in LS 76, where it says Wei Qi passes into foot Yang brilliance, and then the Wei Qi that goes to the foot enters the sole of the foot, exits via the inner malleolus into the Yin phase and reunites with the eye. So this is talking about Wei Qi going from the Yangming channels and then directly circulating into the Yin Qiao. So Yangming is right before the Yin Qiao, and very interestingly, he also makes the point that in Banxiatang, it's actually really an evil afflicting the abdomen, and you could make a sort of an extension to the Yangming area of the stomach and the large intestine, which doesn't allow Wei Qi to pass into the Yin phase, so it gets stuck in the Yang Qiao in the Yang phase. And so again, there seems to be this very close connection between the two. And very clearly it looks like this might be happening at, where does this connection happen? Well, partly it could be happening at the Qi thoroughfare, because actually, as we see in the last quote here, the Yin Qiao vessel is a collateral of the lesser in. This is the pathway of the Yin Qiao vessel. It starts behind Rangu, ascends the inner malleolus, traveling straight up and tracing the inguinal region before entering the Yin phase. So the last place that the Qiao vessel goes before it enters the Yin phase is the inguinal region, which of course is where the Qi thoroughfare is. And so we would imagine, usually when there's a point mentioned on a channel like this, it's very often a pulse point. And so we would imagine that yes, this is indeed talking about the Qi thoroughfare. So now if we go back to the very first quote up here, it says the lower pathway of the Chong Vessel irrigates the great collateral of the foot lesser yin emerging from the Qi thoroughfare. So it looks like all these things are sort of adding up. Okay, there's this connection to Yangming. Everything's connected at the Qi thoroughfare. The upper pathway of the Chong Vessel is connected directly to the Yang Qiao. Could this lower pathway then be connected to the Yin Qiao? It seems quite likely. And if that were the case, then you could say, okay, well, then the Yin Qiao quite likely might be this great collateral of the foot lesser yin. I just mentioned that the Chong Vessel, one way that you can envision its function is to distribute the essence of grain and water from the stomach into the extra channel space. And I just want to show there's a nice two passages from the Spiritual Pivot that demonstrate this. The first is from the Pulsing Points chapter of the Spiritual Pivot, and it says, stomach qi pours up into the lungs. The more aggressive qi of the stomach further surges up into the head, passes through the throat, ascends into the hollow orifice through the eye complex to network with the brain. Now, this has been basically interpreted as talking about wei qi from the stomach, because it's talking about this aggressive qi that surges up. Now notice that this pathway is essentially exactly the same as the pathway of the Chong Vessel, which emerges in the nasopharynx, just as the stomach qi surges into the head through the throat, again the nasopharynx, and into the hollow orifices. And so again, the pathway of the Chong Vessel emerges in the narrow pharynx, seeps into the yang channel collaterals, and then irrigates the eye. So again, this one goes from the hollow orifices and then right into the eye. So it's essentially the same pathway. And again, this is oftentimes the result of their observation of pulsations. Now, very importantly, Huang Longxiang has really noted in talking about this passage that these pulsations were thought of as wei qi, manifestations of wei qi, not yin qi, not camp qi, or construction qi, but rather defensive qi. So again, getting back to this point of this circulation of wei qi being deeply tied to the Chong Vessel, and again, you see it's also, they just say very clearly, it governs seeping and irrigating of the interstices. So when it comes down to it, it looks like that great collateral, which we said great collaterals connect to organs, or they connect to at least the interstices of organs. It looks like that could be the Qiao Vessel. If not, the Qiao Vessel is just so deeply tied to this process that it almost doesn't matter. But I think that that's a very interesting way, and I'll go back to this later, of conceptualizing the relationship between the Chong Vessel and the Qiao Vessel, is that the Chong Vessel is sort of distributing this wei qi from that's just sort of like exploding or surging out from the stomach, and it goes, one part of it goes up to the head, and then it goes into the eye, and then of course the Yang Qiao vessel is bound up in the eye complex, and it actually then communicates with the brain. That's not part of this talk, but it's in the book. And then the lower part of it, the Chong Vessel, it surges down into this femoral artery, which is another pulsing point expression of wei qi. And again, it's this nexus of the Yin Qiao channel, the Yangming brilliance, and the Chong Vessel. And so again, this is where it then communicates, you could say, with the Yin Qiao vessel, which again, just as in the brain where the Qiao vessel is functioning to conduit this Wei Qi into this extrachannel space, it's doing the same thing in the abdomen. It's conduiting this this Wei Qi into this extrachannel realm of the abdomen and these interstices that surround the organs. And so that's a more complicated but more specific version of the kind of vision of the circulatory system that's going on in terms of the connections between the various 8 extras and the circulatory system proper. Okay, so now we've more or less established that the Qiao vessel is a kind of collateral insofar as it networks with this interior region of the abdomen. This is sort of like how Huang Longxiang refers to the great collaterals. He talks about the spleen and the stomach. They all either conduit qi and blood from an organ or away from an organ. And so you could say that the Qiao vessels are doing this, although they seem to be conduiting to a more general space of the interstices of the abdomen. And so how do, the next question is, in the Inner Canon, how do they conceive of collateral mechanisms of disease? Because obviously if we're going to treat, we need to know how these diseases come about. So this says, evil invades the skin and lodges in the tertiary collateral channels where it lingers and blocks the flow of circulation. The qi of the tertiary collateral channel is thus not able to filter back into the channels and backs up into the great collaterals. So here we have this evil qi. It's sort of, well, first we have this vision of the circulatory system where qi is going from the great collaterals out into the tertiary collaterals, and then into the extra channel space, and then back into the tertiary and the collaterals, and then back into the channels. But here what happens is, because there's this blockage in the extra channel space, it means the tertiary collaterals, first, they can't flow outward, and so then that backs up into the great collaterals. And so in this case, what happens, Wei Qi moves from the collaterals into the skin. Qi and blood circulate between the collaterals, like I just said. If the qi and blood stagnates there, then the collaterals, well, they're not flowing, right? Then they distend and rise to the surface. And so what do you get? You get like spider veins and stuff like that. So this is their vision of how that happens. Now this is happening at the skin, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen elsewhere as well. You see in the simple questions, they'll say cold qi lodges within the membrane source of the small intestine. So again, this is right in the area of where the Qiao vessels are acting. It says, among the collaterals in the blood, this is where this cold qi lodges. The blood stagnates and does not flow in the large vessel unless it lingers and does not course. So again, we see the exact same thing happening described in the Inner Canon in these interior spaces, these interior extra channel spaces, acting in the same way as these exterior extra channel spaces like the skin. So as it turns out, this cross needling technique, which we'll get into more in a second, it also acknowledges the fact that, okay, well, cross needling is typically for collaterals, but that doesn't mean that it's only talking about collaterals in the skin. It's also, as it says, when evil qi lodges amongst the 5 organs, the vessels might pull on each other and there's pain, cross needle. and find the vessel manifesting the disease and bleed it. So that it just means that this cross needling technique, which we'll talk about, which is for collaterals, it also applies to the interior of the body, and to, well, you could imagine the Chong Vessel. All right, so what is cross needling, and how does it pertain to the Chong Vessels? The spiritual pivot gives a pretty good explanation of a pretty clear explanation of cross needling. It says, if there is pain with no apparent pathology in the channel, use the cross needling method. Search for collaterals in the cutaneous region and bleed them. This is the cross needling method. So the first thing to note is it says there shouldn't be a pathology in the channel. Okay, so how do you find that? Well, in this context, what it means is that there should be no abnormality in the pulse point or the source yuan point of the channel. So if it, it's not too distended, if it's not, there's no rapidity or anything manifesting at the source point, then you can look to these, what they call the collaterals in the cutaneous region, what we would probably think of now, mostly as these spider veins. So again, going back to our favorite guy, Huang Longxiang, he says that the cross needling chapter is mostly talking about these spider veins that appear, and treating illnesses that specifically are connected to spider veins appearing at certain locations. So in his opinion, even though it says, collateral, it'll say lo in Chinese, we don't necessarily, for instance, it might say, oh, the collateral of the xiao yin, the lesser yin, or the collateral of the yang brilliance. We shouldn't necessarily understand that as the actual collateral listed in LS10 for these channels. It's more just what he thinks it means is these spider veins that are appearing, especially on the feet, and basically below the elbows and the knees, on the channel pathways, and then these spider veins, as they appear, they seem to always appear at the same time as certain illnesses manifest, and then by bleeding them, then you can actually cure these illnesses. And so this is actually a really important chapter for people who are interested in bleeding for that reason, because there's just a treasure trove of information on different indications, and yeah, and so the as he puts it, it's sort of like these collaterals. They're basically just like experience points in a way. Bleed here, and then it fixes this problem wherever, and it lists each one. And so an example of this says, when evil attacks the Yang Qiao vessel, there's pain in the eye, beginning from the inner canthus. Treat by piercing twice, half a sun below the lateral malleolus. So, in this case, again, we would look for like some sort of spider vein or something below the lateral malleolus at Shanmai, BL62, and this would be indicated for this pain in the eye. And truly, this is how someone like Huang Longxiang believes that this was the very first indications for the Yang Qiao, and we'll get to the Yin Qiao below. Before they would have been co-opted into any kind of theory, just they had these sort of very basic indications first. And so the other thing to notice is that it's this, if it's occurring on the right, then pierce the left. If it's occurring on the left, pierce the right. So that's the other, very important sort of specialty of cross needling, and that's of course why they're called cross needling. Now, this particular passage in the LS63, this cross needling section, it goes on to say, when someone falls and is injured, blood stagnates internally. There's abdominal bloating, fullness, and inhibition of bowel movements and urine. First use purgative herbs. This represents an injury to the reverting in channel as well as the lesser yin collateral. To treat, let below the medial malleolus at Rangu, kidney 2, and at the pulse point on the dorsum of the foot. So I think that might be Zhongfeng on the liver channel. If symptoms do not improve, let blood at the 3 hair region. For maladies on the left, pierce the right. If there's tendency to bouts of sorrow, use the same treatment. So a lot of times people just say, okay, this is just talking about using Rangu and Zhongfeng that I just mentioned, and then Sanmao, or the 3 hair region, for these. But, you know, I think, in my opinion, it's also saying that it should be using Zhaohai, or kidney 6, because it says to treat let below the medial malleolus. And so I have some arguments for why that's the case, but we see that basically it would be saying for this, in all these situations, because of some blockage of circulation, in this case it's due to someone falling, and in this bloating and fullness and inhibition that occurs as a result, you can look for some spider veins below the inner malleolus at Zhaohai or kidney 6 and bleed. And so why do I think that this is definitely talking about Zhaohai, even though basically no one says that? Well, the first thing is just because at the top it already talks about the Yang Qiao vessel, and then right below it talks about the medial malleolus, so it just seems like it should be talking about Yin Qiao. But then also the AB Canon seems to agree with me, because for Zhaohai, or kidney 6, it says it's indicated for fright, tendency to bouts of sorrow, and fall and injury, which is exactly referring to this line that we just discussed. So, I mean, I think that's a pretty good indication. And then actually also in the spiritual pivot, Yin Qiao is indeed indicated for dribbling urinary block, another of the diseases just indicated, and it talks about it in combination with the 3 hair region, which was also mentioned in that passage. So it's just, I mean, it's all stacking up as far as I'm concerned. So not only, you know, is Zhaohai good in the sense for this qi and blood circulation related issues in the abdomen, in the lower abdomen, but it's also a good diagnostic indicator. If we see spider veins in this area, we can think, okay, well, maybe there's some sort of issue with the circulation, and especially given what we know about the function and the sort of pathomechanism of the Yin Qiaos, where they seem to manifest in disease when you have some malfunctioning of the circulation of Wei Qi into the abdomen. So it all kind of comes together. Now, someone mentioned, you know, could it also be used to treat tumors? And I think I just wanted to mention, because someone asked that, well, in this line that we talked about just before, where it says cold qi lodges in the membrane source of the small intestine, the blood stagnates and does not flow into the large vessel, and thus it lingers and does not course. This is, again, it says over time it turns into an accumulation. So yes, insofar as, you know, these diseases of exochannel qi not circulating properly in the abdomen, indeed the simple questions believes that this can lead to accumulation. So we can imagine tumor, or some sort of problem, like a gynecologically related tumor or some sort of growth, right? These could all be treated in that way, and indeed, I think in modern times we see they are. And I know, I think in Machiocha it says that for pain on one side of the abdomen, and that being related maybe sometimes to fibroids, for instance, that Yin Qiao would be indicated. And of course, this makes sense for the reasons we talked about, for the fact that collateral diseases are treated with cross needling, right? So if it appears on one side, needle on the other side. Look for that that spider vein there and bleed there. These are great treatment options. And so just that we're clear on how this all works, there's a good analysis of the mechanism around cross needling. It says, when evil attacks the collaterals in the interstices surrounding the organs, it causes them to become blocked. This in turn influences the functions of the organs and bowels, manifesting in disease. By cross needling the spider vein, evil qi is expelled and circulation restored to the collaterals. So this, what we can think of the evil qi being expelled, is just this circulation is restored, basically, by bleeding at the spider vein. So that more or less concludes my coverage of the collateral aspect of the Qiaos for this talk. So I mean, just to summarize the Qiaos, the Yin Qiao is collateral, maybe a great collateral of the lesser yin kidney channel that interfaces and networks with the interstices of the abdominal region, and it conduits Wei Qi into and out of that area. Now, when there's some sort of external evil that attacks the abdomen, or some sort of functional breakdown that impedes the circulation of Wei Qi in the abdomen, it affects it causes a backup, so to speak. It backs up into the Qiao collateral, and then that manifests as spider veins appearing, most prominently spider veins in the case of cross needling at the inner malleolus at kidney 6. And so the treatment strategy in this case, for instance, in these problems of the circulatory problems of the abdomen, is to bleed superficially at these spider veins. So that's one potential treatment. Now, actually, the spiritual pivot does mention another kind of treatment strategy. So it says, talking again in this Banxia Tang passage in Evil Lodging in LS 71, when yang is replete, the Yang Qiao vessel is distended. Because Wei Qi is unable to enter the yin phase, yin is vacuous and the eye is unable to close. Supplement what is deficient and drain what is replete. So again, our friend Zhang Jingyue comes through and says, supplement what is deficient that means to supplement Zhaohai, or kidney 6, and drain what is replete means to drain at Sanmai, or bladder 62, and these are connected to the Yin and Yang Qiao respectively. Now again, in another chapter it says, the Yellow Emperor asks, what qi causes yawning? This is from Kou Wen. Sorry, I don't have the name in English here. Thus, when yin qi accumulates below, but yang qi is not yet exhausted, yang draws upward, yin draws downward, the true drawing in opposition, this results in frequent yawning. Drain foot lesser yin, supplement foot greater yang. Okay, again, Jingyue says this is absolutely referring to Zhaohai and Senmai. So these two illnesses, they have sort of a common ground, which is this Yang Qiao and Yin Qiao, or the spaces that they refer to or network to, both being included in the disease. In the case of sleep, is sort of this first quote is talking about sleep. Um, the person is insomnolent; they can't sleep because Wei Qi is unable to enter into the yin phase, and so the Yang Qiao vessel distends just in by the same sort of logic as the Yin Qiao vessel would distend that we talked about before. And then the Yin Qiao vessel is vacuous because there's nothing in there, and so this is saying we supplement what is deficient, we drain what is replaced. So in this case they're saying supplement at Zhaohai and drain at Yang Qiao. So this is sort of a different angle than what we saw with in the simple questions technique for treating the Yang Qiao vessels. This is saying, because actually in LS71, the evil is very much in the abdomen, the Yang phase. But this is saying to supplement the abdomen, the in phase, supplement at Zhaohai, because basically it's saying we want to draw basically Wei Qi or blood down into the abdomen. So we supplement at Zhaohai, and then we drain at Yang Qiao because we want to drain basically blood or Qi from the brain, in my opinion. And so it's this working synergistically between the two, which is a little bit different from the simple questions technique, but it's also a viable technique. Now in this, it doesn't really mention bleeding, so one would imagine that this you could actually use a needling technique. However, you're going to needle to supplement and and drain at these spots. So it's a bit of, as I said in my first lecture, there's a bit of contradiction sometimes between the simple questions and the spiritual pivot. But of course, when it comes down to it, the clinic is the final proving ground, and you can use both of these. You can look for instance, you can look for spider veins at Shenmai or BL62 and kidney 6, or you can even look for, in this it's sort of saying if there's like a distended and maybe pulsating vessel at either Yin Qiao, at either kidney 6 or bladder 62. If you feel a pulse at either of those, and it's a very big pulse, it's too big, or it's too small, then again, that might be an indication that you can use this balancing approach of using Yang Qiao and Yin Qiao synergistically, or you can just try it out both ways. I think that the comforting thing about this kind of research is it says, well, there was never a definite answer. They're both viable options. They both were obviously used in clinic from the very beginning. So just try them out, and know these signs. Typically, when we're talking about a channel, we are looking at a pulsing point. Especially in when we're talking about inner canon sort of diagnostics, but truthfully, I don't often feel that, like clinically, I don't often feel a pulsing point there, but I have seen it although it might also be construed as being the kidney source point as well, and just being at a slightly lower location. But in any case, it tells you, okay, in this case, that might be what you want to look for if you're using the spiritual pivot approach. But as I say, both are sort of viable. Just one, I would say, probably the simple questions approach. It seems to sort of be more consistent with theory insofar as it really is the treatments that's applied for collaterals. And if we're viewing the Qiao vessels as collaterals, then it would seem to be more quote unquote right. But again, you can use both and just see for yourself. This talk has already gone pretty long, and I feel like probably most people, I don't know, what I've said so far is already kind of complicated, and it probably takes enough to just digest this. So I'm not really going to go into the Yang Qiao collateral because the Yang Qiao is actually more complicated than the Yin Qiao. Well, just if you get a chance, you can have a look at the book and see what I say in there. It's pretty interesting insofar as it goes into a lot of the what the early authors, the early physicians thought of the brain and the brain space and how it sort of contrasts with current understanding. So that's something to look out for. But in general, just the Yang Qiao, it's similar to Yin Qiao in that it just sort of it conduits Wei Qi into and out of the brain, and in this case, it does so via the eye complex, and so that's a whole nother issue. And it goes into some anatomical research as well. In my opinion, the Yin Qiao and the Yang Qiao, they don't actually have to directly connect. They don't have to be sort of like collaterals to each other. They're just collaterals from their channel, either the Xiaoyin, the lesser Yin or greater Yang, to the sort of extra channel space that they service, like the either the brain or the abdomen. Now, in my opinion, maybe the way that we can think of the connection between them is via the Chong Vessel, which seems to be conduiting Wei Qi up to the brain and then down also into the abdomen from the stomach, which we touched upon earlier, or not. But in any case, as I said, this passage here talking about the upper pathway of the Chong Vessel and the lower pathway, they both just seem to be very, very much tied explicitly to Qiao vessel's circulation and function. So it's just very compelling, but obviously there's no smoking gun. Now, there's also the fact, just for why I don't think that Yin Qiao and Yang Qiao actually have to connect, is they don't connect in the classic of difficulties. Actually, the Yin Qiao only goes up to the throat, and what do you know? It connects there to the Chong Vessel. So in the class of difficulties, they actually make this observation that the Yin Qiao vessel is connecting to the Chong or the thoroughfare vessel, and it does so at the throat. We can imagine that it basically does that at Renning point, the aortic artery. So this, as I said earlier, Huang Longxiang, he sort of thinks that these pulses indicate Wei Qi, not Yin Qi. So again, the pulsing at the aortic artery or at Renyin, it would be like this indication of Wei Qi, and that's why we see the description of stomach Qi surging upward, being connected. That's why Huang Longxiang thinks it's connected to Wei Qi, and also the Chong Vessel being connected to Wei Qi. And again, the Yang Qiao and Yin Qiao vessels are also, insofar as they're connected to the pulsing at the Qi thoroughfare, at the femoral artery, and the pulsing at the aortic artery, they're obviously very prominently involved in this circulation of Wei Qi. So in my opinion, insofar as in Qiao, it actually, there's no mention of any diseases of the head being treated with in Qiao in the simple questions. It's only treated with in Qiao in the spiritual pivot. And indeed, there's also a quote saying, if there's pain at the inner canthi, use Yin Qiao. But actually, I think it's either the AB Canon of Moxibustion or in the Grand Basis, Tai Su, it actually says Yang Qiao. So that could even just be a clerical mistake. But the reason I think that Yin Qiao was eventually co-opted in the spiritual pivot to be connected to the brain is because of something that I talk about in the previous lecture and in the book, that basically they had access to anatomical studies that showed the optic nerves, the crisscross of the optic nerves inside the brain, and they thought, oh, this is cool. This really explains why sometimes we get these, the cross needling effect, which obviously the Yin Qiao is implicated in, and also we get this strange hemiparalysis and stroke, and so because the Yang Qiao vessel was seen to treat hemiparalysis. It's used in a few and also Yin Qiao and Yang Qiao both are they both have cross needling applications, and so they thought, well, this would be a good way to explain this. Okay, well, it has to do with, to a degree, with this crossover in the brain, and so you see an exact description of basically the optic nerves in the spiritual pivot, and I show this in the previous lecture. And then this description is, then they say, well, these are actually the Yin and Yang Qiao vessel. Okay, so that only appears in the spiritual pivot. It doesn't appear in simple questions. It's just a new sort of, you can think of it as an innovation maybe, or maybe it's just one school's opinion. But that's more or less the major reason that the Yin Qiao vessel would need to go to the head. I think it doesn't really have any. There's no sense in which it should do that in the from what we see in simple pivot, in simple questions, and Hall of Brightness indications. So that's sort of my opinion. Obviously, other people are going to have different opinions on the matter, but I just find it kind of confusing, if anything, to connect it to the eye, when in fact it's always treating the abdomen more or less, except in the case of clerical errors. And so I think hopefully that'll allow people to focus their treatments a little bit more, and not be so confused by, okay, so when should I use the Yin Qiao or Yang Qiao? Aren't they both sort of, indicated for the eye or for somnolence? The contradictions inherent in the early accounts of the Qiao vessels just make it kind of confusing. So hopefully this kind of research, where we reconstruct the theory and try to bring some coherence to it, will then translate into more clarity and lucidity in treatment choices in clinic. So to that end, if people have any questions about any of this weird sort of speculative theory that I've brought up today in the talk, please don't hesitate to either leave a comment on YouTube, or you can reach out to me directly. I'll be happy to answer any questions. I only got like 3 or 4 questions, I think, on the last video. It's okay, but I mean, I enjoyed the dialogue with people, and I think we can all learn from each other. So please do not hesitate to ask. And with that, I'll be concluding this video. So thank you.